Snow came early to Red Canyon that year, swallowing the desert trails beneath thick drifts of white and turning the frontier town into a frozen graveyard of silence. The wind screamed through the narrow streets hard enough to rattle saloon windows and shake loose old wooden signs that had hung untouched for decades. Ranchers hurried indoors before sunset, stable doors slammed shut against the cold, and every lantern in town burned longer than usual, as if the people feared darkness itself. Near the edge of town, beside a dry creek buried under snow, a black stallion stood alone against the storm. His ribs showed beneath his frost-covered coat, and one of the old leather straps still hanging from his neck dragged through the ice like a chain. Snow clung to his mane in frozen knots while the bitter wind cut across his scarred body. He looked like a creature the wilderness had already claimed, yet his proud posture refused to surrender. The townsfolk called him Ghost. Nobody knew exactly where the horse had come from. Some claimed he belonged to a gambler who froze to death in the northern mountains years ago. Others swore the stallion once carried a feared outlaw who disappeared after robbing a silver train near the Colorado border. In Red Canyon, stories grew faster than weeds, and lonely winters gave men too much time to talk. What nobody argued about was the horse's bad luck. Every ranch Ghost wandered near eventually drove him away. He broke fences searching for hay, frightened livestock, and carried the wildness of open country in his eyes. Men who spent their lives taming horses hated the way the stallion stared back at them without fear. That evening, Ghost limped toward the Mercer Ranch just as the storm thickened across the valley. Smoke rose from the ranch house chimney, and warm light spilled from the barn windows onto the snow. The smell of hay drifted through the air strong enough to make the starving horse stop in his tracks. Inside the barn, 12-year-old Caleb Mercer stacked feed beside the stalls while rubbing warmth back into his frozen hands. He was small for his age, thin from hard winters and harder work, but his sharp gray eyes noticed things other people missed. When he heard the restless snort outside, he moved toward the barn door carefully. The moment he cracked it open, freezing wind burst inside. Ghost stood several yards away beneath the blowing snow, motionless as stone. Caleb had seen the stallion before from a distance, usually crossing the hills beyond town at dusk, but never this close. The horse looked worse than the rumors. Frost coated his eyelashes, and fresh blood stained one of his front legs where ice had cut into the skin. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Caleb glanced back toward the ranch house before slipping outside with an armful of hay. "Easy now," he whispered. Ghost pinned his ears slightly, uncertain. Caleb lowered the hay onto the snow and backed away. Hunger finally overcame caution. The stallion stepped forward and began eating desperately, steam rising from his nostrils into the freezing air. A faint smile touched Caleb's face. "You ain't cursed," he muttered softly. "You're just alone." The barn door suddenly slammed open behind him. "Boy!" Caleb stiffened immediately. Elias Mercer marched through the storm carrying a lantern in one hand and a shotgun in the other. Thick-bearded and broad-shouldered, he looked carved from old oak, hardened by years of droughts, cattle thieves, and frontier survival. Since Caleb's father died, Elias had run the ranch with iron discipline and little patience for weakness. His eyes narrowed the second he spotted Ghost. "That devil horse again." Ghost jerked his head upward, sensing danger instantly. "He's starving," Caleb said quickly. "I was just given him. I can see what you were doing." Elias shoved past the boy and raised the shotgun slightly. The stallion backed away through the snow but refused to fully turn his back. "That animal's trouble," Elias growled. "Men around here lose stock every winter because of wild beasts roaming hungry through the valley. Next thing you know, he'll kick apart the stable or spook the herd. He ain't hurting nobody. He's eating feed we paid for." Ghost took another slow step backward, muscles tense beneath his frozen coat. Caleb swallowed hard. "Please don't shoot him." The wind howled between them. For a moment, Elias seemed ready to ignore the plea entirely. Then he lowered the gun slightly with visible irritation. "One more time I catch that horse near my ranch, I'll put him down myself." Ghost suddenly wheeled away and vanished into the blowing snow before either could move again. Caleb watched until the darkness swallowed him completely. "You get attached to weak things," Elias said coldly behind him. "That's dangerous out here." Caleb didn't answer. He remembered the look in the stallion's eyes far too clearly, not angry, not savage, only exhausted. Later that night, the storm worsened. Snow hammered against the ranch house windows while freezing wind moaned across the plains like distant wolves. Caleb lay awake beneath heavy blankets listening to the weather and thinking about the horse wandering somewhere beyond the hills. Most animals would have already found shelter. Ghost had nowhere to go. Unable to rest, Caleb quietly climbed from bed and pulled on his coat. He slipped downstairs, grabbed leftover carrots and a small sack of oats from the kitchen, then crept outside into the storm before anyone noticed. The cold struck like a knife. Snow reached nearly to his knees as he crossed the ranch yard carrying the lantern low against the wind. He followed fresh hoofprints leading away from the barn toward the frozen creek. "Ghost!" he shouted weakly into the darkness. Only wind answered. Then, somewhere beyond the drifting snow, came the faint sound of a horse breathing. Caleb lifted the lantern higher. Underneath a crooked cottonwood tree near the creek bank, Ghost stood trembling violently. Snow had gathered across his back so thick he looked carved from ice itself. One of his front legs barely held his weight anymore. The stallion did not run this time. Slowly, Caleb approached and emptied the oats onto the ground. Ghost lowered his head cautiously, eating while Caleb stood close enough to see every scar crossing the horse's body. Some looked old, but others were fresh. Rope marks circled the stallion's neck and chest, signs somebody had once tried very hard to break him. "You fought everybody, didn't you?" Caleb whispered. Ghost lifted his head slightly at the sound of the boy's voice. Then Caleb noticed something else. Burned faintly into the leather strap hanging from the horse's neck was a worn symbol almost hidden beneath frost, the mark of a rearing stallion inside a circle. Caleb's eyes widened. He had seen that symbol before. Years ago, hanging inside the Red Canyon saloon, there had been an old wanted poster carrying the very same mark beside the name of a vanished outlaw rider. Before Caleb could think further, distant voices echoed through the storm from the ranch. Men carrying lanterns moved across the snow. Elias was looking for him. Ghost immediately raised his head, alert and tense, prepared to flee again despite exhaustion pulling at every movement. Caleb reached out carefully and touched the stallion's frozen neck for the very first time. "You better run," he whispered. Ghost stared at him one long second, breath steaming into the bitter air. Then the black stallion disappeared into the blizzard, leaving Caleb alone beside the frozen creek while the storm swallowed the sound of hoofbeats heading toward the mountains. By morning, Red Canyon had vanished beneath the storm. Snow buried the wagon trails, rooftops sagged beneath thick layers of ice, and the church bell froze silent above the town square. Men who had crossed deserts, survived gunfights, and wrestled cattle through flash floods now stared nervously at the white horizon beyond their windows. The frontier respected strength, but winter respected nothing. At the Mercer Ranch, Caleb stood near the barn doors watching snow swirl across the valley like smoke from a battlefield. He could still hear Ghost's fading hoofbeats from the night before, disappearing into the mountains where no horse could survive long in weather like this. Behind him, ranch hands worked in tense silence. "Fence lines gone on the north ridge," one muttered while pulling off frozen gloves. "Cattle scatter if this keeps up." "They already found 2 steers frozen stiff near Miller Creek," another answered. Elias Mercer listened while sharpening a hunting knife against a whetstone near the fire barrel. The scraping sound cut through the barn like a warning. "This storm ain't breaking soon," he said. "We protect what's ours first. Nothing else matters." Caleb lowered his eyes, knowing exactly who Elias meant by "nothing else." The boy spent the entire morning hauling feed, chopping ice from water troughs, and helping secure loose stable doors against the wind. Every task left his fingers numb despite heavy gloves. Still, his thoughts drifted constantly toward the black stallion somewhere beyond the snowy hills. At noon, the storm worsened. The sky darkened until afternoon looked like dusk, and violent wind battered the ranch hard enough to shake the walls. Horses inside the stable grew restless, stomping nervously while snow slipped through cracks in the wood. Then came shouting from outside. A ranch hand burst into the barn carrying a rifle. "Something's near the herd." Men grabbed lanterns and rushed into the storm. Caleb followed despite Elias barking for him to stay back. Near the western pasture, shapes moved through the blowing snow. At first Caleb thought wolves had reached the cattle, but then he saw the familiar outline standing beyond the fence. Ghost. The stallion looked weaker than before, his black coat nearly white beneath layers of frost. Yet he stood tall against the storm, staring toward the cattle with hollow but determined eyes. One frightened steer suddenly broke from the herd and crashed through a loose section of fencing into the snowstorm. Panic spread instantly among the animals. "Damn it," a ranch hand shouted. Before anyone could react, Ghost lunged forward. The stallion sprinted across the snow with startling speed despite his injuries. He circled the fleeing steer and drove it back toward the herd with sharp movements, cutting off its escape exactly like a trained cattle horse. The men froze in disbelief. Ghost stopped several yards away once the steer returned safely behind the fence. Steam poured from the horse's nostrils as he stood trembling from exhaustion. "He's been worked before," one ranch hand muttered. "That ain't wild behavior." Elias narrowed his eyes. For the first time, Caleb saw uncertainty replace anger in the older man's face. Then Ghost staggered. His injured leg nearly collapsed beneath him before he regained balance. Caleb stepped forward immediately. "He needs shelter." "No," Elias said sharply. "He just saved the herd. And tomorrow he'll tear through our feet again." The wind screamed harder between them. Caleb clenched his fists. "You can't leave him out there." Elias grabbed the boy's shoulder roughly and pulled him back. "You think kindness keeps people alive out here?" he growled. "Winter kills weak animals. That's the frontier." Ghost watched silently while snow gathered across his scarred body. One ranch hand shifted uncomfortably. "Boss, maybe we oughta let the horse warm up in the outer stable till the storm passes." Elias turned cold eyes toward him. "You paying for the feed?" The man fell silent. Caleb stared at the stallion, anger burning behind his eyes now. "He ain't weak." For a moment, Elias looked ready to strike the boy for talking back. Instead, he released him slowly. "That horse brings trouble," he said. "And trouble gets people buried." Without another word, Elias ordered the men back toward the ranch house. Ghost remained alone near the fence line. Caleb lingered behind until the others disappeared into the snow. Slowly, he approached the stallion again, this time close enough to see fresh blood running down the injured front leg. Ghost did not move away. "You shouldn't have come back," Caleb whispered. The stallion lowered his head slightly, breathing hard. Caleb glanced toward the ranch house windows glowing through the storm. If Elias caught him helping the horse again, punishment would come hard this time. But leaving Ghost outside felt worse somehow, like abandoning the last living thing in Red Canyon that understood loneliness. He pulled an old wool blanket from the fence rail nearby and carefully draped it across the stallion's back. Ghost flinched at first but remained still. "There," Caleb murmured. "Ain't much, but it's something." Suddenly the stable doors slammed open behind them. Elias stormed through the snow with two ranch hands carrying rope. Caleb's stomach tightened immediately. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Ending this." The ranch hand spread out carefully toward Ghost. The stallion sensed danger at once. His ears flattened, muscles tightening beneath the blanket. "We'll drive him into the mountains," Elias said. "Far enough he won't come back." "In this storm?" Caleb stared at him in disbelief. "He'll die out there." Elias grabbed the blanket off Ghost's back and threw it into the snow. "Then he dies." The word struck Caleb harder than the freezing wind. Ghost suddenly reared slightly as one ranch hand swung a rope toward him. The stallion twisted away with surprising agility and bolted across the pasture. "Move!" Elias shouted. The men mounted horses and charged after him into the blizzard. Caleb ran to the fence helplessly as the chase disappeared into swirling snow beyond the hills. He could barely make out Ghost's dark shape racing against the storm while lantern lights followed close behind. Then even those vanished. Night fell early over Red Canyon. Hours passed with no sign of the riders returning. Inside the ranch house, tension spread heavier than the storm itself. Wind rattled every window while snow piled against the doors high enough to trap them inside by morning. Caleb sat near the fireplace pretending to read, though his eyes never stayed on the pages. Every creak outside made him look toward the windows. Finally, near midnight, hoofbeats thundered into the yard. The ranch hand stumbled through the door half-frozen and furious. "We lost him," one snapped while pulling ice from his beard. "Horse led us straight into Dead Man's Pass before disappearing." Another man cursed under his breath. "Nearly got us killed." Elias entered last, snow-covered and silent. Caleb searched their faces immediately. "Did you find him?" Elias removed his gloves slowly before answering. "No." Relief washed through Caleb so strongly he nearly smiled. But Elias stepped closer, his expression darker than before. "That horse is smarter than most men," he said quietly. "And if he keeps circling this ranch, sooner or later somebody's gonna get hurt." The room fell silent except for the storm outside. Then one exhausted ranch hand muttered words that chilled Caleb more than the weather ever could. "Boss, there were wolf tracks up near Dead Man's Pass." Caleb's heartbeat slowed. Beyond the frozen hills, somewhere deep inside the mountains, Ghost was alone again, wounded, starving, and now hunted by something even crueler than men. The storm buried the frontier deeper with every passing hour. Snow swept across the mountains in violent waves, erasing trails, freezing rivers, and swallowing entire stretches of wilderness beneath endless white. Even seasoned hunters stayed indoors now, knowing the frozen country beyond Red Canyon had become a death trap. But Caleb Mercer could not stop thinking about Ghost. The image of the black stallion vanishing into Dead Man's Pass haunted him through the night. He imagined the wounded horse limping through deep snow while wolves followed somewhere behind, waiting patiently for weakness to slow him down. By dawn, Caleb had made up his mind. He slipped from bed before sunrise and quietly dressed beneath the pale glow of a lantern. Every movement felt dangerous. Elias slept only one room away, and if he discovered Caleb leaving the ranch during the storm, there would be no forgiveness this time. Caleb pulled on his father's old wool coat, stuffed dried meat into his satchel, and crept downstairs. The house groaned beneath powerful wind outside. Near the front door, he hesitated briefly while staring at the rifle hanging above the fireplace. His father once carried it during cattle drives through Wyoming territory. Caleb remembered him saying that the frontier punished fear faster than bullets ever could. He took the rifle carefully. Then he stepped into the storm. The cold hit with brutal force. Snow reached past his knees in places, and the wind clawed at his face hard enough to steal breath from his lungs. Visibility stretched only a few yards ahead before the blizzard swallowed everything in white darkness. Still, Caleb pushed forward toward Dead Man's Pass. He followed faint horse tracks where the riders had chased Ghost the night before. Most had nearly vanished beneath drifting snow, but enough remained for him to continue climbing into the mountains. Hours passed slowly. The deeper Caleb traveled, the quieter the world became. No birds. No cattle. No sound except screaming wind and the crunch of boots through ice. Then he found blood in the snow. Fresh. Caleb's heartbeat quickened immediately. A trail of dark crimson drops led toward a narrow canyon between frozen cliffs. He tightened his grip on the rifle and followed carefully. That was when he heard the growling. Low. Hungry. Caleb froze. Shapes moved through the storm ahead. 3 wolves circled near a cluster of snow-covered rocks, their gray bodies barely visible against the blizzard. Their attention focused on something hidden beyond the drifted snow. Ghost. The stallion stood trapped between icy boulders, sides heaving violently with exhaustion. Blood stained his injured front leg nearly black against the snow, and his breathing came in painful bursts. Yet despite his condition, he still fought. One wolf lunged. Ghost struck with both front hooves, smashing the animal backward into the snow with terrifying force. Another wolf darted toward his side, but the stallion twisted and snapped hard enough to drive it away. Caleb had never seen anything so desperate or fearless. The wolves attacked again. Caleb raised the rifle with shaking hands. The shot exploded through the canyon. The wolves scattered instantly into the storm, disappearing between the cliffs. Silence returned except for Ghost's heavy breathing. Caleb lowered the rifle slowly and approached. "You stubborn fool," he muttered, though relief filled his voice. Ghost remained tense at first, ears pinned while steam rose from his nostrils. Then recognition softened his posture slightly. The stallion was failing. Caleb could see it clearly now. His injured leg trembled constantly, and frost clung thick around old scars crossing his chest and shoulders. Even standing seemed to cost him enormous effort. "You can't stay here," Caleb whispered. The wind intensified suddenly, carrying a deep cracking sound across the mountains. Caleb looked upward sharply. Snow shifted high above the canyon walls. Avalanche. "Move," he shouted instinctively. The mountains roared. Snow thundered down the cliffs in a violent white wave, swallowing trees and rock alike. Caleb ran blindly toward Ghost as the ground shook beneath him. The stallion lunged forward at the last possible second. Something slammed into Caleb's side hard enough to knock the breath from him. Then darkness. When Caleb opened his eyes again, everything felt silent. Snow covered half his body, and freezing pain shot through his arms and legs. For one terrifying moment, he could not remember where he was. Then he saw Ghost. The stallion stood nearby beneath a leaning pine tree where the avalanche had missed them by only a few yards. Snow coated his mane and back, but he remained standing somehow. Caleb struggled upright slowly. The canyon behind them had vanished beneath tons of snow. If Ghost had not shoved him aside, he would already be dead. The realization settled heavily in his chest. "You saved me," he whispered. Ghost lowered his head weakly. Caleb moved closer and placed a hand against the stallion's neck. Beneath the freezing coat, he could feel violent trembling. The horse had almost no strength left. Snow continued falling harder. Caleb looked around desperately. The avalanche had destroyed the trail completely, and the storm erased every landmark beyond a few feet. They were lost. Fear crept into Caleb's stomach then, cold and heavy. He remembered stories about travelers freezing to death in these mountains, found months later beneath melted snow with their horses still standing nearby. The wilderness did not care how brave a man believed himself to be. A sudden gust nearly knocked Caleb off balance. Ghost staggered again. "We gotta find shelter," Caleb said quickly, though he had no idea where to look. The stallion suddenly lifted his head. His ears twitched toward the north side of the canyon. Then, despite exhaustion, Ghost began limping slowly through the storm. Caleb followed. The horse moved carefully across buried rocks and snowdrifts as if remembering something hidden beneath the wilderness. Several times Caleb nearly lost sight of him completely in the blizzard, but Ghost kept going. Finally, after nearly half an hour, dark shapes appeared through the snow ahead. An old mining cabin. Its roof sagged heavily beneath ice, and half the walls looked ready to collapse, but smoke stains still darkened the chimney from years long past. Caleb almost laughed with relief. They forced their way inside. The cabin smelled of frozen wood and dust. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, but one corner remained dry enough for shelter from the wind. Caleb quickly blocked gaps in the walls with loose boards while Ghost stood near the doorway trembling uncontrollably. "You're not dying here," Caleb said firmly. He gathered old wood from the ruined cabin and struck several matches before flames finally caught inside the rusted fireplace. Warmth spread slowly through the tiny room. Ghost lowered himself carefully onto the floor nearby. Caleb knelt beside him. For the first time, the stallion no longer looked fierce or untamed. He looked tired. Ancient almost. Like a creature that had spent too many years fighting alone. Caleb unwrapped the blood-soaked cloth around Ghost's injured leg and discovered something hidden beneath the frost. An old bullet wound. Not fresh. Years old. The flesh around it had healed badly, leaving a deep scar that explained the stallion's limp. Caleb stared quietly. "Who did this to you?" Ghost rested his head against the wooden floor without answering, his dark eyes half-closed beside the firelight. Outside, the storm continued raging across the mountains. Then, somewhere far beyond the cabin walls, wolves began howling again. And this time, they sounded much closer. The wolves circled the cabin through the entire night. Their howls rose and faded with the storm, sometimes distant, sometimes so close Caleb could hear claws scraping across the snow outside the walls. The fire crackled weakly inside the ruined mining cabin while freezing wind slipped through every crack in the wood. Caleb barely slept. He sat beside Ghost with the rifle across his lap, feeding broken planks into the fire whenever the flames weakened. Across from him, the black stallion rested on the floor with his breathing slow and uneven. Every so often Ghost lifted his head toward the sounds outside, ears twitching sharply despite exhaustion. By dawn, the storm had become even worse. Snow blocked most of the cabin door, and pale gray light barely reached through the iced windows. Caleb's hands shook from cold and hunger as he stared at the dying fire. They could not stay there much longer. The woodpile was gone. The food was nearly gone. And sooner or later the wolves would grow bold enough to test the cabin walls. Caleb rose stiffly and looked outside through a crack in the boards. Nothing but endless white mountains. "We need to get home," he muttered. Ghost slowly struggled to his feet. The stallion nearly collapsed once before steadying himself. His injured leg looked worse now, swollen badly from the journey through the canyon. Yet when Caleb opened the cabin door, Ghost stepped forward without hesitation. The wind hit them immediately. Snow blasted across the mountains so thick it stung like sand against their skin. Caleb pulled his coat tighter and tried to judge direction through the blizzard, but the world looked unfamiliar now. The avalanche had changed the landscape completely. Ghost walked ahead first. Caleb followed closely beside him, trusting the stallion's instincts more than his own. Hours passed in miserable silence. The cold drained strength from Caleb's body piece by piece. His boots became soaked with melted snow, and his fingers burned painfully despite thick gloves. Several times he stumbled through hidden drifts nearly waist deep. Ghost continued forward relentlessly. The stallion limped badly now, each step uneven against the frozen ground, but he never stopped moving. More than once Caleb noticed fresh blood staining the snow behind him. "You gotta slow down," Caleb said weakly. Ghost ignored him. Near midday, the mountains opened into a narrow ridge overlooking a frozen river below. Wind screamed across the cliffs hard enough to shake loose sheets of ice from the rocks. Caleb froze suddenly. Fresh wolf tracks covered the ridge ahead. Ghost saw them too. The stallion's ears flattened instantly. A low growl echoed nearby. Then another. Shapes emerged slowly through the storm. 5 wolves. Their gray coats blended almost perfectly with the snow as they spread across the ridge, cutting off the path forward. Hunger burned in their pale eyes. Caleb's stomach tightened. He raised the rifle quickly, but his frozen fingers slipped against the trigger guard. The wolves kept advancing. Ghost stepped in front of Caleb. The stallion lowered his head, muscles tightening despite exhaustion. Steam poured from his nostrils into the bitter air. One wolf lunged first. Ghost exploded forward with terrifying force. His front hooves crashed into the animal, sending it tumbling sideways across the ridge. Another wolf darted toward Caleb, teeth bared. The rifle fired. The shot echoed across the mountains while the wolf collapsed into the snow. The others attacked instantly. Chaos erupted across the ridge. Ghost kicked and struck wildly while wolves snapped at his legs and sides. Caleb tried to reload the rifle with numb hands, but panic made every movement clumsy. One wolf leaped directly at him. Before Caleb could react, Ghost slammed into the animal midair, knocking it violently against the rocks. The stallion screamed in pain as another wolf's teeth tore into his shoulder. Caleb grabbed a broken branch from the ground and swung desperately, driving the attackers back long enough for Ghost to break free. "Run!" Caleb shouted. Ghost bolted down the ridge. Caleb followed through deep snow while wolves chased close behind. The frozen river stretched ahead like a sheet of dull gray glass beneath the storm. Ghost charged onto the ice without slowing. Caleb hesitated only a second before following. Behind them, the wolves kept coming. Halfway across the river, a loud crack split the air. The ice shifted beneath Caleb's boots. Fear shot through him instantly. Ghost! The stallion turned sharply at the sound. Then the river shattered. Caleb plunged into black freezing water so cold it stole his breath immediately. The current dragged him beneath broken ice while panic exploded through his chest. He clawed upward desperately. A hand broke the surface. Then another. But the ice crumbled every time he tried pulling himself free. The current began carrying him downstream beneath the frozen river. Suddenly Ghost appeared above him. The stallion raced across the cracking ice beside the water, keeping pace while Caleb struggled against the current. Without hesitation, Ghost lowered himself dangerously close to the edge. Caleb grabbed the leather strap hanging from the stallion's neck. Ghost pulled. Muscles strained beneath his scarred body while the ice cracked violently under his hooves. For one terrible second Caleb thought they would both fall through. Then Ghost dragged him onto solid ice. Caleb collapsed coughing violently, every inch of him shaking uncontrollably from the freezing water. The wolves stopped at the far side of the river, unwilling to cross the broken ice. Ghost stood over Caleb breathing hard. Blood covered the stallion's shoulder now, and one of his legs trembled so badly he could barely remain upright. "You saved me again," Caleb whispered through chattering teeth. Ghost nudged him roughly with his nose as if demanding he stand. Caleb forced himself back up. The storm began fading slightly by late afternoon, revealing distant shapes through the snow-covered valley below. Red Canyon. Relief nearly overwhelmed Caleb. "We made it," he breathed. But the journey was far from over. The freezing river water had soaked through Caleb's clothes completely. His legs felt heavier with every step downhill, and dizziness blurred his vision. He stumbled often now, barely able to keep pace beside Ghost. Darkness crept slowly across the frontier. Lantern lights finally appeared far ahead near the town outskirts, glowing faintly through the falling snow. Ghost saw them too. The stallion gathered what little strength remained and moved faster. Caleb tried to follow but collapsed suddenly into the snow. His body refused to rise again. Cold spread through him like sleep. Through blurred vision, he watched Ghost stop several yards ahead. The stallion turned immediately and limped back toward him. "No," Caleb whispered weakly. "Keep going." Ghost lowered himself beside the boy. Caleb barely understood what was happening until the stallion nudged him upward repeatedly with his head. The horse wanted him to climb on. "You can't carry me," Caleb muttered. Ghost pushed harder. Tears mixed with melting snow on Caleb's face as he struggled onto the stallion's back. Ghost staggered beneath the added weight but somehow stayed standing. Then the black stallion began the final ride toward town. Each step looked painful now. Blood dripped steadily into the snow behind him while violent trembling shook his body from exhaustion. Yet Ghost kept moving through the storm toward the distant lights of Red Canyon. Closer. Closer. At the edge of town, people suddenly emerged from buildings at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Voices shouted through the wind. "That's Caleb." "Good Lord." Lanterns rushed toward them across the snow-covered street. Ghost took several final staggering steps beneath the glowing lights of town. Then the stallion collapsed. The streets of Red Canyon fell silent the moment Ghost hit the ground. Snow swirled around the collapsed stallion while townsfolk gathered beneath lantern light, staring in disbelief at the horse they had spent years fearing and chasing away. Caleb slid weakly from Ghost's back and dropped into the snow beside him, barely able to stand after the frozen journey through the mountains. "Get the boy inside," someone shouted. Caleb ignored them. His shaking hands reached for the stallion's neck instead. "Ghost," he whispered desperately. The black horse lay motionless except for the faint rise and fall of his breathing. Blood soaked the snow beneath him from the wolf attack, and frost covered his mane like silver ash. Up close, he no longer looked wild or dangerous. He looked broken. Elias Mercer pushed through the crowd carrying a lantern. The older man stopped cold when he saw Caleb alive beside the stallion. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then his eyes traveled across Ghost's wounded body, the torn shoulder, the bloodied legs, and the deep marks left by the frozen wilderness. Understanding slowly replaced the hardness in his face. "He carried you home," Elias said quietly. Caleb nodded weakly. The crowd murmured among themselves. Men who once called the stallion cursed now stared with shame written plainly across their faces. One ranch hand removed his hat slowly. Another lowered his eyes toward the ground. Without warning, Ghost tried to rise. The stallion's legs trembled violently beneath him before collapsing again into the snow. A painful sound escaped his throat, low and exhausted. Caleb grabbed his neck immediately. "Easy, easy. Get him into the stable," Caleb pleaded. "Please." Nobody argued this time. Several men rushed forward with blankets while others cleared a path through the snow toward the Mercer barn. Even Elias joined them, helping lift the wounded stallion carefully from the frozen street. Ghost barely remained conscious during the walk. Inside the stable, lanterns filled the darkness with warm golden light. Horses shifted nervously in nearby stalls while snow melted slowly from Ghost's scarred body. Caleb stayed beside him the entire time as the townsfolk cleaned wounds and wrapped torn flesh with fresh bandages. Old Doc Bennett arrived shortly after midnight. The gray-haired doctor knelt beside Ghost and examined the injuries silently for several minutes. His weathered face grew grim. "What is it?" Caleb asked. Doc Bennett removed his glasses slowly. "This horse should have died days ago." The word struck the stable harder than the storm outside. Doc Bennett pointed toward the old bullet scar near Ghost's front leg. "That wound never healed proper. Been carrying pain for years." His hand moved toward the wolf bites across the shoulder. "And this," he shook his head quietly. "The cold alone would kill most animals." Caleb swallowed hard. "Can you save him?" The doctor hesitated too long before answering. "I'll try." The hours dragged painfully. Wind battered the barn walls while lantern flames flickered low into the night. Most townsfolk eventually returned home, but Caleb refused to leave Ghost's side. He sat beside the stallion with one hand resting gently against the horse's neck, listening to each strained breath. Near dawn, Elias approached quietly. For once, the older man's voice carried no anger. "You should get some rest." Caleb shook his head immediately. Elias stared at Ghost for a long moment. "I was wrong about him." The admission sounded heavy, as though the words cost him pride he had carried for years. "He saved me," Caleb whispered. "Twice." Elias nodded slowly. "Seems he saved more than that." Outside, the storm finally began to weaken. Morning light crept across Red Canyon for the first time in days, revealing buried streets, frozen rooftops, and a frontier town changed by one terrible winter night. Inside the stable, Ghost stirred weakly. Caleb leaned forward immediately. "Hey. I'm here." The stallion opened his dark eyes slightly. For a brief moment, the fierceness returned to them, not fear, not rage, but the same stubborn strength that had carried them through the mountains. Caleb smiled through tears. "You made it home." Ghost breathed softly against the boy's hand. Then Doc Bennett stepped closer, his expression careful. "Caleb." The boy looked up instantly. The doctor's silence told him everything before a single word came. "No," Caleb whispered. Ghost's breathing had grown shallow now, each breath slower than the last. The stallion no longer fought the exhaustion pulling him down. His body had simply endured too much for too long. Caleb pressed his forehead gently against Ghost's neck. "You ain't alone anymore," he whispered shakily. "You hear me? Nobody's chasing you now." The stable stood completely silent. Even the horses in nearby stalls seemed strangely still. A faint breeze slipped through the barn cracks, carrying the final remnants of the storm outside. Snowflakes drifted softly through beams of morning sunlight. Ghost exhaled once more. Then he stopped moving. Caleb's face crumpled instantly. For the first time since his father's death, he cried openly. Elias rested a rough hand on the boy's shoulder but said nothing. There were no frontier words strong enough for moments like this. By afternoon, the entire town gathered near the ridge overlooking Red Canyon. The storm clouds had finally broken apart, revealing endless white mountains shining beneath pale winter sunlight. Cowboys, ranchers, shopkeepers, and travelers stood together in silence while Ghost was buried beneath the old cottonwood tree near the frozen creek where Caleb had first fed him. Someone placed the worn leather strap atop the grave. The symbol burned into it, the rearing stallion inside a circle, caught Caleb's attention again. Doc Bennett noticed. "That mark belonged to a rider named James Calloway," the doctor said quietly. "Best horseman I ever knew." Caleb looked up. "Outlaw?" Doc Bennett gave a faint smile. "Depends who you asked." He glanced toward the grave. Calloway disappeared during a winter crossing almost 10 years back. Folks said his horse kept wandering the frontier afterward waiting for him. Caleb stared silently at the snow-covered mound. Waiting all those years. Alone. Elias removed his hat beside him. "Deserved better than what we gave him." The town agreed. Spring eventually returned to Red Canyon. Snow melted from the valleys, cattle trails reopened, and wagons rolled through town once more. But people spoke differently after that winter. No one called the black stallion cursed anymore. Travelers passing through the frontier began hearing stories about a horse named Ghost who crossed a deadly storm to save a boy's life. Cowboys repeated the tale around campfires from Texas to Montana, each version growing larger than the last. Some swore Ghost outran an avalanche. Others claimed he fought an entire wolf pack alone. Caleb never corrected the stories. Years later, whenever winter storms rolled across the frontier and wind howled through the mountains, folks in Red Canyon still remembered the sound of hoofbeats echoing faintly beyond the snow. And sometimes, late at night near the frozen creek beneath the old cottonwood tree, Caleb would pause and look toward the distant hills. Because every now and then, through the blizzard and darkness, he could have sworn he saw a black stallion standing against the storm once again.